There are only 12 minutes of breathable air left in the small steel sphere at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Two men are sitting as high as they can in the cramped cabin, their heads brushing the ceiling because the carbon dioxide they are breathing out is heavier than air and is slowly filling the floor like an invisible rising tide. They are 480 meters below the surface, a depth where the pressure is so immense it would crush a human body in an instant. No one has ever been rescued from this deep before, and for 84 hours, the world has been holding its breath while these two men have been running out of theirs. To understand how Roger Chapman and Roger Mallinson ended up in this underwater tomb, we have to go back to the early morning of August 29th, 1973. They were over 100 miles southwest of Ireland, working for a company called Vickers Oceanics on a routine mission to lay transatlantic telephone cables. Roger Chapman was a 28-year-old former Royal Navy officer, a man with short dark hair and a focused expression who served as the pilot. His partner, Roger Mallinson, was a 35-year-old engineer with a thick beard and a heavy wool sweater who knew every bolt and wire of their vessel, the Pisces Three. The Pisces Three was a 20-foot-long yellow submersible, a state-of-the-art machine for its time. It had 3 spheres inside its outer skin, but only one of them, the crew cabin, was designed to hold people and stay dry. The dive began at 1:15 in the morning, and for 8 hours everything was perfectly normal. They worked on the seabed, moving slowly through the dark, and by 9 o'clock they were ready to be picked up by their mother ship, the Vickers Venturer. As the submersible bobbed on the surface, waiting for the recovery crew to secure the tow line, a freak accident occurred. A heavy tow line snagged on the hatch of the aft machinery sphere, which was located at the back of the vessel. Suddenly, the hatch was wrenched open. This was a catastrophic failure because the aft sphere was not meant to be open to the sea while the vessel was in the water. Within seconds, over a ton of seawater rushed into the back of the submersible. The extra weight made the Pisces Three incredibly heavy, and the tow line snapped under the strain. Chapman and Mallinson felt the vessel lurch violently as it began to sink backward, plunging away from the light of the surface and back into the abyss. They were falling fast, reaching speeds of 40 miles per hour. In the cramped, dark interior of a metal sphere, the two men knew that hitting the bottom at that speed would likely kill them. They had to act quickly to prepare for the impact. They grabbed white cloths and stuffed them into their mouths to prevent biting their tongues off when they hit. They curled into tight balls on cushions, bracing themselves against the equipment as the depth gauge spun wildly toward the limit. When the gauge hit 500 feet, Chapman turned it off. He was afraid the pressure would cause the glass on the instrument to explode into their faces. They fell the rest of the way in silence, waiting for the end. At 9:30 in the morning, the Pisces Three slammed into the seabed at 1,575 feet. The impact was massive, but the pressure hull held. They were alive, but they were buried in a gully of soft silt that blocked their view and muffled their sonar. The first thing they did was check for leaks. The crew cabin was dry, but they were in a desperate situation. They had almost no food, just 1 cheese and chutney sandwich and 1 can of lemonade between them. But their biggest concern was oxygen. Normally, a dive like this carried enough air for a few extra hours, but Mallinson had made a decision before the dive that would change everything. On a sudden whim, he had replaced a half-full oxygen tank with a completely fresh one. It was against protocol to change a tank that wasn't empty yet, but that extra half tank of oxygen was the only reason they had a chance at all. Even with it, they knew they had to conserve every breath. On the surface, a massive rescue operation was mobilizing. The Vickers Venturer called for help, and soon the Royal Navy ship HMS Hecate and the Canadian cable ship John Cabot were on their way to the coordinates. but reaching them was the problem. There were only a handful of submersibles in the entire world capable of reaching that depth, and they were thousands of miles away. 2 other Pisces subs were rushed to the scene by plane and ship. Down on the seabed, Chapman and Mallinson were trying to stay calm. They spoke as little as possible to keep their heart rates down. The temperature in the cabin dropped to near freezing, and dampness began to coat every surface. To help the searchers find them, Chapman did something unexpected. He began to sing and shout at the top of his lungs. He hoped that the acoustic sensors on the surface ships might pick up the vibrations of his voice through the water. On the surface, the searchers were struggling. The Pisces Three had landed in a gully, and the silt it had kicked up made it difficult for sonar to get a clear reading. It wasn't until the second day that they finally had a solid lead on the location. The first rescue attempt was made by Pisces Two. It was launched in the early hours of August 31st, but the mission was aborted almost immediately. The rescue sub suffered a leak in its own pressure hull and had to be pulled back up before it met the same fate. Next, Pisces 5 was sent down. It managed to find the Pisces 3 on the seabed, but the pilot couldn't attach a recovery line. The currents were too strong, and Pisces 5 ran out of battery power before it could finish the job. Inside the trapped sub, the air was becoming toxic. Carbon dioxide levels were rising, causing the men to suffer from crushing headaches and extreme lethargy. They were so tired they could barely keep their eyes open, but they knew that if they fell asleep, they might never wake up. They decided to eat their only food. They split the cheese and chutney sandwich and shared the can of lemonade. It wasn't much, but it gave them a tiny burst of energy to keep going for a few more hours. By the morning of September 1st, they had been underwater for over 70 hours. A new tool had arrived on the scene: the United States Navy's CURV-3, a remote-controlled recovery vehicle that had famously recovered a lost hydrogen bomb years earlier. Pisces 2 had been repaired and was sent down again. This time, the pilot was successful. He managed to attach a specially designed toggle and a heavy polypropylene line to the flooded aft sphere of the Pisces 3. A few hours later, the CURV-3 robot attached a second line. The rescue team now had 2 solid connections to the trapped sub. They were finally ready to start the long climb back to the surface. At 10:50 in the morning, the winch operators on the surface began to pull. The ascent was not smooth. Because the Pisces 3 was full of water in its back section, it was heavy and unbalanced. It jerked and swung wildly as it rose through the water column. Inside, Chapman and Mallinson were being tossed around. The movements were disorienting, and the change in pressure made the metal hull groan and pop. They didn't know if the lines would hold or if the sub would break apart before they reached the top. At 1:17 in the afternoon, the Pisces 3 finally broke the surface. But the danger wasn't over. The sub was bobbing in heavy waves, and the hatch was still sealed shut. The air inside was almost completely gone. The recovery team jumped onto the slippery hull, desperately trying to unscrew the hatch bolts. But the bolts were jammed. The impact and the pressure had slightly deformed the metal, making it impossible to turn them by hand. For 30 agonizing minutes, the rescuers fought with the hatch while Chapman and Mallinson waited inside, breathing the last few liters of usable oxygen. They could hear the banging of the tools on the hull, but they were too weak to shout back. Finally, at 1:47, the hatch was wrenched open. Fresh air rushed into the cabin, and the 2 men were pulled out into the sunlight. They had been submerged for 84 hours and 30 minutes. When the engineers later checked the oxygen tanks, they found something chilling. There was only about 12 minutes of breathable air left. If the rescue had taken just a quarter of an hour longer, they would have found a tomb instead of survivors. The story of the Pisces 3 is often called a mechanical failure, but a later inquiry revealed something more human. An unauthorized modification had been made to the hatch locking nut weeks earlier, which allowed the tow line to accidentally unlock it. Roger Chapman and Roger Mallinson both survived their ordeal and, remarkably, both eventually returned to work in the subsea industry. They remained friends for the rest of their lives, bound by the 84 hours they spent in the dark. Their rescue remains the deepest successful recovery of a manned vessel in history. It serves as a reminder that in the face of impossible odds, survival often comes down to a few minutes, a single sandwich, and the will to keep breathing. Thank you for watching this story of survival. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to help us share more interesting stories with the world.